Andrea Doria incident. On July 23, 1981, 34-year-old John McMurray prepared for what would become one of the most challenging wreck dives of his career. His dive partner, Robert Chen, was a 29-year-old marine archaeologist from Boston who specialized in maritime disasters. The two men had planned this expedition for months, studying blueprints and survivor accounts of Andrea Doria's final hours. The luxury liner had sunk in 1956 after colliding with the Stockholm, coming to rest 240 feet below the surface of the North Atlantic. Weather conditions were optimal that morning, with calm seas and minimal current. McMurray and Chen conducted their equipment checks methodically. They carried twin steel tanks filled with nitrox, powerful underwater lights, and emergency backup regulators. Their dive plan was ambitious but calculated. They would penetrate the wreck through Gimbel's Hole, a breach in the first-class section that had been widened by previous salvage operations. At 9:15 a.m., both divers began their descent down the shot line. The Andrea Doria appeared gradually through the blue-green water, her massive hull looming like an underwater mountain. Even after 25 years on the ocean floor, the ship's elegant lines were still visible beneath layers of marine growth. McMurray signaled to Chen as they reached the penetration point. The opening was large enough for two divers, but jagged metal edges required careful navigation. They clipped their guide line to the exterior hull and began their entry into the ship's interior. Inside, their lights revealed a maze of collapsed corridors and debris-filled passages. Silt covered everything in a thick layer, undisturbed for decades. The two divers moved slowly, following their guide line deeper into the first-class dining area. Chen photographed ornate fixtures and furniture, while McMurray monitored their air supply and bottom time. 20 minutes into the penetration, they reached their planned turnaround point near the ship's grand staircase. But that's when McMurray made a critical error. While turning to signal Chen about their exit, his fins disturbed a pile of debris that had been precariously balanced against a collapsed bulkhead. Instantly, decades of accumulated silt exploded into the water column. The visibility dropped to 0 in seconds. McMurray reached for his guideline, but it had become entangled in falling debris from the disturbed ceiling. He tugged on the line, trying to free it, but the movement only made the silt cloud worse. In the chaos, Chen became separated. McMurray's breathing rate increased dramatically as panic set in. His air consumption doubled. The familiar corridor had become an alien maze of twisted metal and floating sediment. He tried to follow what he thought was their original path, but the interior structure had shifted over the years. Passages that had been open during their entry were now blocked by collapsed debris. McMurray found Chen 15 minutes later, unconscious in a debris field, with his regulator out of his mouth. McMurray immediately began sharing air and attempted to navigate toward an exit. His air gauge showed dangerously low levels as he dragged Chen through the silted corridors. When McMurray finally emerged from the wreck, he was nearly out of breathing gas. Chen was unresponsive. Despite immediate CPR efforts on the dive boat and emergency transport to shore, Robert Chen died from drowning and decompression injuries. Britannic incident. On September 14, 2009, Carl Spencer stood on the deck of a chartered dive boat in the Aegean Sea, preparing for one of the most ambitious wreck dives attempted that year. Spencer was a 41-year-old British technical diving instructor with certifications in mixed gas diving and wreck penetration. His dive partner, Andreas Franke, was a 38-year-old underwater photographer from Germany who had documented dozens of deep wrecks across the Mediterranean. Their target was the HMHS Britannic, the massive hospital ship and sister vessel to the Titanic, resting 390 feet below the surface. The Britannic had struck a mine in 1916 and sunk in just 55 minutes, but unlike her famous sister, she remained largely intact on the seabed. Spencer and Franke planned to explore the ship's medical bay, a section that had never been properly documented. Their breathing gas consisted of trimix, a mixture of oxygen, nitrogen, and helium, designed for extreme depth diving. Each diver carried multiple tanks and backup regulators. The dive plan called for a maximum bottom time of 18 minutes with extensive decompression stops during their ascent. The descent began at 10:30 a.m. along a shot line that led directly to the wreck's superstructure. As they dropped through the water column, the massive scale of the Britannic became apparent. At 882 feet long, she dwarfed every other wreck in the Mediterranean. Spencer and Frank reached the ship's deck and immediately swam toward their planned penetration point near the twisted remains of the propeller shaft area. They entered the wreck through a large opening created when the ship struck the seabed. Inside, permanent guidelines left by previous expeditions marked safe routes through the upper decks. The two divers followed these lines deeper into the ship's interior, their powerful lights revealing pristine corridors frozen in time. Medical equipment and hospital beds were still visible through doorways. After 12 minutes of exploration, they reached the medical bay complex, a series of interconnected rooms that had served as operating theaters and recovery wards. Spencer was photographing a surgical table when his primary regulator suddenly failed. The breathing gas tasted metallic and harsh, indicating contamination in his gas mixture. He immediately immediately switched to his backup regulator, but within seconds realized this gas supply was also compromised. Spencer signaled frantically to Franca, who immediately began sharing his air supply. Both divers were now 300 feet inside the massive ship, far from any exit. Franca attempted to navigate back toward the entrance using the permanent guidelines, but the stress of the emergency caused confusion. Instead of heading toward the exit, they took a wrong turn deeper into the ship's bowels. The corridor system was more complex than their dive plan had anticipated, with multiple branching passages leading to dead ends. Spencer began showing signs of oxygen toxicity from the contaminated gas mixture. His movements became erratic and uncoordinated. Franca faced an impossible choice. Continue trying to rescue Spencer and risk both their lives, or abandon his partner to save himself. The shared air supply was depleting rapidly, and they had already exceeded their planned bottom time by several minutes. Franca continued searching for an exit while supporting Spencer, but the Britannic's maze-like interior offered no clear escape route. When Frankie finally located a way out, Spencer had lost consciousness. Frankie managed to bring Spencer to the surface, but the extended time at depth with contaminated breathing gas had caused irreversible damage. Carl Spencer was airlifted to a decompression chamber in Athens, where he died 3 days later from gas toxicity and decompression sickness. The incident led to stricter gas mixture testing protocols for technical wreck diving expeditions. USS Monitor incident. On August 16, 2002, Dr. Sarah Mitchell prepared for what should have been a routine archaeological documentation dive. Mitchell was a 36-year-old marine archaeologist working for NOAA's Maritime Heritage Program, specializing in Civil War-era shipwrecks. Her dive partner, James Rodriguez, was a 32-year-old technical diver from Virginia Beach, with extensive experience in deep wreck operations. Their mission was to document the turret mechanism of the USS Monitor, the famous ironclad warship that had revolutionized naval warfare in 1862. The Monitor lay 240 feet below the surface off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, protected as a national marine sanctuary. Weather conditions were challenging, with a moderate sea state and strong subsurface currents, but within acceptable limits for the planned operation. Mitchell and Rodriguez carried specialized archaeological equipment, including high-resolution cameras, measuring devices, and sample collection tools. Their breathing gas consisted of enriched air nitrox to extend bottom time at depth. The dive plan followed strict NOAA protocols with predetermined penetration limits and emergency procedures. They would enter the wreck through an authorized breach in the hull and navigate to the turret assembly using established guidelines. The descent began at 11:45 a.m. using a weighted shot line that anchored directly to the Monitor's deck. The historic ironclad appeared through the murky water as a low, dark silhouette covered in marine growth. Despite 140 years on the ocean floor, the ship's revolutionary design was still clearly visible. Her distinctive rotating gun turret dominated the forward section, partially collapsed but largely intact. Mitchell and Rodriguez reached the penetration point and clipped their safety line to the exterior hull. Inside, their lights revealed the cramped quarters where Civil War sailors had lived and fought. The interior spaces were remarkably preserved, with personal artifacts and mechanical components still in their original positions. They moved carefully through the narrow passages, documenting everything with photographs and measurements. The turret mechanism was their primary objective, a complex arrangement of gears and pulleys that had allowed the heavy guns to rotate during battle. Mitchell began photographing the machinery while Rodriguez monitored their position and air supply. 28 minutes into the dive, Mitchell became entangled in loose cables that had fallen from the turret housing. The cables wrapped around her tank valves and camera equipment as she attempted to photograph the gun elevation mechanism. Her movements to free herself caused vibrations throughout the weakened structure. Without warning, a section of heavy iron plating that had been weakened by decades of corrosion suddenly shifted. The massive piece of armor crashed down, partially blocking their planned exit route. Rodriguez immediately swam to assist Mitchell, but as he entered the confined space around the turret, a secondary collapse occurred. Heavy debris trapped Rodriguez in a separate compartment, cutting off his communication with Mitchell. The rising tide created stronger currents that pushed through the wreck, making navigation more difficult. Mitchell's air supply became contaminated when disturbed sediments clogged her regulator's first stage. She was forced to switch to her backup breathing system. While still entangled in the cables, both divers were running dangerously low on breathing gas, while trapped in separate sections of the deteriorating wreck. Rodriguez attempted to clear the debris blocking his escape route, but the corroded metal was too heavy to move without proper tools. Surface support lost radio contact with both divers when their communication equipment was damaged in the collapse. The dive boat crew initiated emergency procedures and contacted the Coast Guard for specialized rescue equipment. Recovery divers reached the Monitor 45 minutes later, but the strong currents and complex wreck structure complicated rescue efforts. Mitchell was found unconscious in the turret compartment, her air supply completely exhausted. Rodriguez had managed to reach a small air pocket but suffered severe decompression injuries during his emergency ascent attempt. attempt. Both divers were airlifted to the nearest recompression facility. Sarah Mitchell died from drowning and oxygen deprivation despite extensive medical intervention. The incident led to revised archaeological diving protocols and additional safety requirements for all future Monitor expeditions. Scapa Flow Incident. On June 12, 1994, Mark Thompson, a 45-year-old diving instructor from Edinburgh, led his students David Walsh and Helen Carter to a technical diving expedition to one of Scotland's most famous underwater graveyards. Their destination was Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, where the German High Seas Fleet had been scuttled in 1919. The massive warship wrecks resting in 148 feet of water provided ideal training conditions for advanced wreck diving techniques. Thompson had chosen the SMS König, a 26,000-ton battleship, for their certification dive. Weather conditions were typical for the North Sea, with moderate winds and cold water temperatures hovering near 45 degrees Fahrenheit. The dive plan emphasized strict adherence to penetration limits appropriate for student divers. They would explore only the upper superstructure areas using temporary guidelines, avoiding the ship's more dangerous lower decks and interior spaces. The descent began at 2:15 p.m. along a permanent mooring line that led directly to the König's massive hull. The battleship appeared gradually through the green North Sea water, her enormous size still impressive after 75 years on the seabed. Thompson led his students along the ship's upper deck, pointing out anti-aircraft guns and bridge structures. The wreck was remarkably well preserved in the cold Scottish waters, with much of her original equipment still recognizable. They entered the superstructure through a large opening created when the ship struck the bottom during her scuttling. Inside, temporary guidelines marked their planned route through several deck levels. The ship's scale was overwhelming, with corridors wide enough for multiple divers and compartments larger than most buildings. Thompson maintained close supervision as Walsh and Carter practiced navigation techniques, using their underwater compasses and depth gauges. After 15 minutes of guided exploration, they reached a junction where multiple passages branched off from the main corridor. Thompson was explaining navigation procedures when Walsh became separated from the group. The young engineer had spotted what appeared to be an intact gun turret area and swam ahead to investigate. By the time Thompson noticed Walsh's absence, the student diver had disappeared into the ship's maze-like interior. Thompson immediately initiated search procedures, sending Carter to the surface while he pursued Walsh into the branching corridors. The temporary guideline system only covered the main routes, leaving the deeper areas unmarked and potentially dangerous. Thompson's emergency whistle signals echoed through the steel corridors without response. Meanwhile, Carter panicked during her solo ascent and consumed her air supply rapidly in the confined spaces near the entry point. Thompson found evidence of Walsh's passage deeper into the ship than any student should have attempted. The massive battleship contained hundreds of compartments connected by a bewildering network of passages, stairways, and hatches. Many areas were blocked by debris or collapsed structures that could easily trap an inexperienced diver. The cold water temperature accelerated hypothermia risk, and Thompson realized his own air supply was running dangerously low after 30 minutes of searching. He discovered Walsh in a flooded engine compartment 4 deck levels below their planned route. The young diver was unconscious, floating motionless in the dark water with his regulator out of his mouth. The circumstances of Walsh's predicament were unclear, but his air gauge showed complete depletion. Thompson attempted to revive Walsh while navigating back through the complex structure, but the student showed no signs of life. The emergency ascent with Walsh's body consumed Thompson's remaining air supply, forcing him to make a rapid ascent without proper decompression stops. Surface support had already contacted the Coast Guard when Thompson failed to return at the planned time. A Royal Navy helicopter arrived within an hour, deploying specialized diving equipment and medical personnel. David Walsh was declared dead at the scene from drowning and cold water exposure. Thompson suffered severe decompression sickness, requiring immediate chamber treatment. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.